guys, this is Chapter 2, Key Issue 3, Why Does Population Growth Vary Among Regions? What's really important this time is that we're talking about the DTM, the Demographic Transition Model. Probably the most important thing you will learn out of this unit. You have to memorize it. I tell you here, you have to be able to memorize it. If you see a population pyramid, you better be able to say if it's stage 1, 2, 3, or 4, or even 5 of the DTM. And you should be able to say if a country's DTM is in stage 4, then you should be able to make some accurate assumptions about that country based on what level they are in. Give me 2 seconds. Hold on. My puppies are fighting. Come here. All right, here's Teddy. There he is. Say hi, buddies. There's Teddy. They're getting nice and close. Yay! That's the new puppies. Okay, so you should also be able to connect the model with important events from history like the Industrial Revolution, and especially for the ETM, Epidemiological Transition Model, the Medical Revolutions. Okay? Okay. So you should go through and take notes on the DTM. The book explains that pretty well, and we're going to do a project in class that also goes over that. So just take really good notes on that, and we'll work on it in class, but make sure the bulk of your notes should be about that for this time. Something else you need, however, is something about this guy, Mr. Malthus. So we would probably call him the father of demographics in a lot of ways. He's also, in a lot of ways, an economist. He wrote in the 19th century in England, Essay on the Principle of Population. And he did this at a really important time in England. England was switching from hand-powered crafts to mechanization, right? So like machine-made products, the Industrial Revolution, right? So that means factories are being built, things are being produced really rapidly. And what also happens during the Industrial Revolution is population explodes. So we get a lot more people being born because there's a lot more food, because prior to the Industrial Revolution is the Agricultural Revolution, which we'll talk about more a little bit in the future. So while this is happening, he is noticing the population is growing really quickly, and it's at this point that England moves from stage 1 of the DTM, where all countries were, to stage 2 in the DTM. Okay, and now today they're in stage 4, just to show you how much they've progressed. But basically what Malthus argued is that the world's population will eventually exceed the carrying capacity, and his focus was on food. So he said, even though the Agricultural Revolution was going on and all this other food was being grown, he said, but population is growing too much and too rapidly, so eventually we are going to run out of food. That's what he said. So he said, what do we do about this? Well, there's one thing we could do and just use a little restraint. Go for a walk, England, maybe, instead of having so many babies, an idea. So that's what he called moral restraint. He also focused on these natural checks to population. So things like diseases, right? Natural disasters, famine, starvation, wars. All of these things are things that happen that decrease populations, right? They kill off large amounts of the population. And he said, if it wasn't for these things, possibly population would already be exceeding the carrying capacity. But he said it's kind of a good thing that these happen, and hopefully they continue to happen, because otherwise we're going to, our population is going to grow too much. Okay? So not a very lighthearted guy, but there you go. So was he right? So there's kind of a couple schools of thought on Malthus. So there's neo-Malthusians who say, for the most part, yes, he was correct. They said food, maybe that's a worry, but what's even more a worry is things like water resources and energy resources. So neo-Malthusians would say that the carrying capacity will be pushed when it comes to these types of resources. Okay? They also point out that Malthus did not predict that population would grow in the locations that it has started to grow, right? So he lived in England. He lived in a very much developed, in comparison to the rest of the world at that time, country. And really what has happened in developed countries, as we've seen, that population growth has stopped, while in the LDCs, right, that's really where population growth has grown. So he's actually kind of right. He was just kind of wrong about the geography of where this was going to happen. However, there's others out there, lots of critics of Malthus, who say no, because one thing he didn't take into account is that food, the food supply of the world, is not fixed, okay? Like, you can make more food, you can grow more food, and we have technology that allows us to grow more food than we've ever been able to grow before. So there's many who say that no, that's not true, because as the population grows, we have the ability to create more food, right? Possibilism. And then there's Marxists that argue that it really isn't the population growth that is the problem, it's the inequality that comes with population growth, okay? Okay, so we have population growing really rapidly in for a while in places like China and in places like India and lots of LDCs. So when that's happening, we know that puts a strain on resources. So often governments will try to do something to quell population growth, keep population from growing so much. When that happens, when they're trying to stop that, we call that an antinatalist policy. Okay, so that's where governments enact different laws and measures in order to keep the population from growing. So examples of that would be China's one-child policy, which we are going to have a pretty in-depth discussion of in class in a couple of weeks. But basically it said a Chinese couple could only have one child. And that led to lots of problems, as we will get into. Something else that has happened recently is India has stopped. They made a law that you can no longer get paid to be a surrogate for somebody. So if a couple, for instance, is having infertility issues, they're not getting pregnant, before you could pay someone to carry your child for you, and that doesn't, surrogacy isn't illegal, but you can no longer get paid for it in India. And India has tried lots of different things over the past few decades to quell their population growth, and none have been super effective. On the other hand, if you have a low population or a population that is decreasing really rapidly, like Japan's, for example, Russia is actually also in the same boat, then your government might enact a pro-natalist policy. So that would be to encourage couples to have more babies. So here's a couple of examples. United States, you get tax breaks for households who have children. That is nice. I would argue children probably cost more than your tax break does, so it's kind of nice, and it's pro-natalist in that it's encouraging you to have children. Japan has worked to help fund childhood costs, since most people in Japan would argue, well, I'm not going to have another child or a child at all because I cannot afford to. They've done things where they help you pay for child care and child medical services and things like that to try and ease that, to encourage people to have children. Because China is now having a population problem, and that there are a lot more men in China than there are women, and we'll talk about why that is. They've started enacting a two-child policy recently. My dogs are going nuts. A two-child policy where now you can have 2 children in China. I'm going to pick him up because my other dog's going nuts and I want him to get trampled. Okay, so I think the video is next. Yep. So I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to show you this video about China's two-child policy. And as always, be ready for a pop quiz. Bring any questions in that you think are confusing. I think for key issue 4, I'm not going to do one of my videos. I'm going to do, hi Margie, look. Instead of doing one of my videos, I think I'm going to pull something off of YouTube that explains it a little bit better and gives you really good visuals, better than I can do. Okay, so signing off now.
What's happened today is that the Chinese Communist Party has announced that Chinese couples, wherever they live, countryside, cities, whatever ethnic background they're from, Han Chinese or Tibetan or Uyghur, whatever, they can have 2 children, and that is a huge change. Before today's change, the rules were really complicated, but to simplify, if you lived in a Chinese city, and that's now the majority of Chinese people, you could only have 1 child. If you lived in the countryside, you might be allowed a second if your first was a girl. The reason for the change is the Chinese government's increasingly concerned about having an aging population. It's afraid that China is going to get old before it gets rich, and that may mean that it never gets rich at all. So it wants to encourage people to have children. It's hard to say whether it will work because increasingly Chinese families find having children extremely expensive. They invest a lot of time and a lot of money in their offspring, and it's a very competitive school system and competitive labour market. So a lot of middle-class aspirational parents look at this change and may say, I can't afford a second child anyway.